Al, do you want to do roll call?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. District 1, District 3,
Here.
and I'm here, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair.
we have a quorum, which, next up is review and approval of the agenda. Any adds to the agenda?
Glenn had a couple of self-governance thing there.
Signatory to be added.
Okay, so it'll be
Just that one on Friday.
okay, self-gov.
Yeah.
Self-gov.
And he did send an email to me that he did about something about that Pathfinder thing. But I don't know if you want to wait till next week or the week after or something.
What do you guys think? You guys still want to look at it, or do you want to approve it, or what do you guys think?
I don't know, it's up to you guys. Well, I told him he should be here to present. If he's not here, that's,
Should we just wait till he comes out here for the first meeting?
I think so.
Okay, we'll hold that on.
Oh, Mr. Chair, on April 1st, I have an appointment up in Thief River, but I'll try to get on Teams.
Okay. Anything else to add? Motion to approve the agenda.
Motion.
Motion by Alan.
Was there any changes though?
Yeah,
Just that,
self-gov.
Okay, motion with the changes, or second with the changes. Chair.
Second with the changes from Raymond. All in favor?
Uh-huh.
Annie, are you aye with that? With the changes?
If I say aye.
Okay, Peach, thank you. Our calendar review, we'll do that, but first off, we have Blair Thomas to do the PUC.
Hi, good morning, council. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, very good. My name is Pilar Thomas. I'm a partner with the law firm of Quarles and Brady. We were brought on by Whiter RBC to assist your general counsel's office with working on and developing the utility code for Whiter and for the reservation. And so as I understand it, you've got a copy of the utility code, which in the current draft has some substantial revisions to it from the previously drafted utility code that was up for consideration. Hopefully you have also the presentation that I put together for your review, and I don't have the ability to share it on my screen, but I've got it in front of me, and I don't know if somebody, if you're presenting it on your monitor, if everyone has a hard copy, but we could just walk through that presentation that helps describe what's in the revised utility code. I can point out some of the major changes that we have recommended and that are reflected in this new draft, and happy to take questions as we go along or wait till the end, whichever council would prefer.
Mr. Chair, is it possible? Can we pull up this thing and share?
Blair, is it possible to put it on your screen?
I don't have the ability to put it on my screen. I know your attorneys have it, so.
She's gonna pull it up.
Okay.
Pilar, Aisha's gonna pull it up here on the email here. Just give us like 30 seconds.
Okay.
You just tell us when to advance to the next slide.
Okay, sounds good. While she's doing that, let me just maybe summarize some things that we have done. We did not provide you with a red line to show the difference between your last draft that you looked at and that went out for comment, I believe, and this new draft, partly because there are so many substantial changes that the red line would look like, as we affectionately call it, a murder scene. It would just be red everywhere. So instead, let me just kind of highlight some major changes that we have proposed. First and foremost is we looked at the draft code and asked really three questions. One, what type of provisions we think as lawyers would properly belong in a law. Recognizing, of course, that as your lawmaking process, it's not easy to pass a law. You've got a very involved legislative process. And so some elements of the previous code belong in law because those are going to create legal rights, legal obligations, legal responsibilities. They're going to assert and validate your jurisdictional authorities, your oversight authorities, your regulatory authorities, and of course then some other rights and obligations for the utility companies and for ratepayers of your utilities. The second area that we looked at was what provisions really belong as internal policies and procedures. And that's really kind of how does the commission operate internally? How does it adopt its own rules? What kind of standard operating procedures? And some of the provisions that were in the first draft were very internal, operational in nature. Our view, not a proper place for the law, because if the commission needed to change how it operated, it needed the ability to do that without having to come back to the committee, the RBC, to make that change in the law. So that would create more flexibility, at least in terms of internal commission operations. And then the third group of the third topic that we looked at was what provisions were more appropriate for regulation. And so, and that's kind of the external requirements that again are operational in nature, and that the commission would, through a typical regulatory rulemaking process, would then say to the regulated utilities or others who are subject to the code, here's what else you have to do. So another example of that is the rate making process. When the utility commission sets rates, the law typically says that they have a responsibility to set rates that are just and reasonable or just and equitable. The language depends. But the legislation doesn't typically define what that means, and that's because that's a term of art in utility law, and the factors that inform it can change. So instead, what typical utility commissions do, and we looked at this both from the commission regulatory standpoint, but also from the utility standpoint, what typical commissions do is they will make a rule, and they'll say, here's how we will set rates, and it's in a rule. And the rule, because it's going to have the force of law, people are going to have to comply with the rule, but also it's more flexible, right? Because the commission is changing the rules and not having to come back to the RBC to change the law. So that's the first kind of three lenses that we looked at when we evaluated your draft code. And then we made a lot of recommendations for taking stuff out because it either should be in an internal process and procedure, or it should be in the rules. So what we have now is, in our view, the minimum that should be in the law. And then language that was previously in the last provision, we've separated into two buckets. We've got two other documents going for you. One is an internal rules and process document, and the other is an external rules and rule-making document. So we haven't gotten rid of the language. We've just put them into two other places where once the commission is stood up and you have a commissioner, you have an executive director, then they would work on these two other sets of documents. So that's why you'll see a lot of changes. Another thing that we did was we know that the tribe has been working on some other energy development opportunities. So, for example, you've got, I can understand a proposal to do rooftop solar for 30 of your homes on the reservation. You've looked at and had discussions with some of the utility companies. You have a proposed energy plan that's been presented to the council, to the committee. And so energy development on the reservation, we've also now added provisions that would incorporate energy development efforts as well. And are proposing that the commission would have some level of initial responsibility, not final say, because only the RBC would have final say, but some initial responsibility to help evaluate those energy development efforts, possibly even regulate them, depending on what they are, but certainly having some initial say before, say, for example, the RBC approved a lease to X. The commission would have some work to do to make sure that that's a viable project, that it's going in the right place, that it can be interconnected to the system. So the commission will, in effect, also serve, as we've proposed, as your first layer of expertise for energy development on the reservation. Okay, so real quick, in terms of the draft outline, we have the findings. Chapter 1 is the findings. We did combine some chapters that were duplicative. So we took a bunch of general provisions that were actually in 2 chapters. We put them into 1 chapter. We have chapter 3 is your Tribal Utility Commission. Chapter 4 is the duties of that commission. And this is where we've taken some stuff out and put some stuff in. Chapter 5, duties of your public utilities. Again, we've cleaned some of that stuff up, taken some language out, put some language in, moved language around in many cases. Chapter 6 and 7 are specific to electric utilities. So kind of the overall policy and goals, and you'll see this is some new language in chapter 6 for your policies and goals around your electric utilities. Chapter 7 is how you would set rates and tariffs and that process. We took chapter 8 through 13. We reserved that for your future utility development, so broadband, water, sewer, natural gas. And then chapter 14, we consolidated all of the procedures. And that's really around hearings and how the commission has to minimum due process requirements, for example, for hearings, for taking action against a utility that's in violation of the law or rules and regulations. And then you have civil enforcement, which is not just the utility commission's ability to take action and enforce its own rules, but even your tribal members, the ratepayers. You know, everybody, when you're in a regulated industry, you as a ratepayer have the ability to go to your utility commission and file a complaint against your utility company. And in fact, we just saw, for example, a recent decision that came out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals around a tribal member who sued their utility company in tribal court for violating tribal law. And it was the tribe had a law, as you do in your code here, that utilities can't shut off power or shut off heat in the wintertime. And so this utility violated that law. They shut off this tribal member's power. Tribal member, under the code, the tribal member could go into tribal court and sue the utility, which the tribal member did. It became a big federal case. And so the Ninth Circuit just ruled last week that the tribe did in fact have jurisdiction to enforce this law against their utility. So, so we have this bolstered now, and some of our initial language, in fact, confirms that authority. And now we have a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that also confirms that authority. So that's some good news on the part of the tribe for its asserting its jurisdiction over the utilities that operate on tribal lands on the reservation. Okay, next slide. So chapter 1, findings, and chapter 2, general provisions. Again, in short, this is language and citations that support WIRE's jurisdiction to regulate public utilities. There's a reference to PURPA, that's the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. There's references to some case law. There's references, we of course define reservation, which is your treaty defined. We define the extent of your jurisdiction. We also lay out the necessary language, which we just massaged and kind of cleaned up a little bit. We added some language around the Montana exceptions. If council's aware, committee's aware that, we have this federal case, US v. Montana, that says tribes don't have jurisdiction over non-Indians operating on non-Indian fee land within reservations, except in two circumstances. One is you have a consensual relationship or a contract or some kind of agreement that would bring them under your jurisdiction, or their activity could have an impact on your public health, welfare, economic development, or political rights and obligations. So we've laid out in this, we've cleaned up language a little bit around making sure that both of those prongs can be met. And that's primarily because utilities, of course, have right-of-ways on your reservation for their power lines or their pipelines. And so to the extent that those right-of-ways can be considered fee land, there's another a federal court, Supreme Court decision that says right-of-ways are more like fee land, even though they're not. But so we tried to cover all the bases here with respect to what I like to call the magic language that lays out your purpose, your findings, and the circumstances. We also point out that electricity and energy are not just public goods and commodities, but they are a necessary requirement for your community development, for your economic development, for the public health and welfare of the tribal community. And so energy and electricity, this is not like, buying candy or something. This is a gotta have product. So we point out how important energy and especially electricity are. We also point out how dangerous it is. Electricity is an inherently dangerous thing. So we also point out that regulating electric utilities, regulating natural gas utilities, where that activity is an inherently dangerous activity, is also rationale for why the tribe has jurisdiction over these utilities. And then we update the definitions. Next slide, please. So Chapter 3 focuses on the creation of the commission. So the same, we didn't change any of your draft around how many commissioners, the term, how vacancies happen. We did change up a little bit with respect to if a vacancy occurs, the council, the committee, of course, can appoint a new commissioner. We have left it that the council, the committee, the RBC will appoint the commissioners. We would note that in some jurisdictions, those commissioners are actually elected. For example, in Gila River Utility Authority, their board of directors is elected by the tribal membership. So don't know if that's something that you guys have considered, but just wanted to let you know there are some different models for how you could appoint commissioners. One is the committee, the RBC appoints the commissioners. The other is the commissioners get voted on by tribal membership at large. So we've left it as you had originally crafted it. We did change the names to chair and vice chair because that's typically the label. It's not really a president. This is not a board of directors. This is a regulatory body. And then we created a little bit more detail on the responsibilities of the chair and vice chair. We also created we kind of renamed the executive director and kind of clarified some of the authorities of the executive director. Okay, next slide. So the administrator was renamed as executive director. There may be other directors. The reason why we label executive director is because there may be other directors that in the organization or director level positions. So you might have a director, for example, of electric utilities. versus a director of natural gas utilities. So that will depend, of course, on how much you expand the code itself and start to take on more utility regulatory action under the code. And so this gives them room to create some higher level roles within the departments of the commission. We created a little bit more succinct description of the director's function. And then again, this is an example, we pulled out all of the language that created kind of the detail for how the commission will operate. And instead that would go into an internal standard operating procedures for the commission to decide the best way for them to operate. And then of course, if it doesn't work, they can change those procedures again so that they get something that works for them without having to come back to the RBC to amend the law if they have to change procedures. Okay, next slide. So chapter 4, we did pull out some powers and duties. We more clarified the commission's authority. We want to make sure they have the kind of bandwidth to oversee all the activities that you've identified under for them. You want them to be able to operate under both current and future circumstances. So we've added some language that provides some broader authority for the commission to regulate utilities and other related activities. So, you know, we start, of course, they have the general supervision of all utilities, providing utility services on the reservation, except as otherwise provided in the code. So, what you don't want is utilities to argue that the utility commission doesn't have the right to regulate them. The RBC, the code, you know, takes the RBC's authority to regulate activities on the reservation, right? That's your inherent sovereign authority to regulate all economic activity on the reservation. You're using this code to delegate that authority to the commission for purposes of utility regulation. And so there's, you know, a principle in statutory interpretation that if you have a long list of things, if it's not on the list, it wasn't intended to be included. And so while we can't possibly know all of the types of circumstances that the commission may need to regulate, at least we can't know it today, we want to make sure that it has the future, the ability to regulate certain activities in the future without having to come back to the code to amend the code. So this statement that they have general supervision gives the commission the ability to react to future circumstances, but two, and most importantly, I think it makes it does not give the utilities the ability to say, well, that's not on your list of authorities. You can't regulate that. This language would let them. So there is some responsibility on the part of the commission, of course, to be sound and reasonable regulators. So they shouldn't be regulating things obviously outside of their purview, and their regulations should be sound and reasonable. But of course, they will be doing regulations through a notice and comment, following due process to establish rules and regulations. So people will have the ability, including, of course, your tribal members, to have a say in what the commission does regulate when they enact rules to do that regulation. The utilities will also have that ability. But what we don't want is the utility to go, yeah, it's not on your list, so you can't regulate this. So that's part of the principle behind having this broad authority kind of explicitly listed so that it gives you some future regulatory authorities. Okay, next slide. So in terms of chapter 4 continued, of course, the commission has the discretion to hold investigations, inquiries, hearings, even though, again, the list is prescriptive. We want the commission to have broad discretion that allows the commissioners to be more responsive in decision-making. And then it also covers the administration of the commission's powers, such as how it conducts its hearings, and those are referenced under the commission's rules and regulations. So the commission, again, it may find that conducting hearings a certain way, and the charge here is that in the statute now, the proposed code is that the commission has to follow general notions of due process. If you're going to enact a rule or regulation, then you have to go through a notice and comment process and give people an opportunity to be able to respond, react, provide their comment, and then you respond to that. If you conduct a hearing, it has to follow basic, again, notions of due process. You have to give people a notice that you're going to conduct a hearing on them. Here's what the hearing's about. Give them the opportunity not just to be heard at the hearing, but even to have counsel if necessary. So we lay out some of that in the statute that really focuses on due process. But the guts of how a hearing or how an investigation or how a rulemaking will occur will be in the regulations themselves. Next slide.
I got
Yes,
a question.
Yes.
So this would apply to, like, for example, wild rice and otter-tail and some of these utilities out here?
Yep. Any utility that is operating on the reservation, so whether it's a retail utility, distribution utility like Ottertail, or Wild Rice, any of your electric utilities, this will apply to, the utility is defined very broadly. So if you have a natural gas pipeline that's running through your reservation, that pipeline operator is a utility under your code. And that natural gas pipeline would be subject to the commission's regulatory authority. If you have your G&T is Great River, right? I think is the big generation and transmission utility for the co-ops. I don't know if you have any Excel power lines out there, but you might have power lines that cross the reservation. They don't serve the reservation, they just cross it. Like the big bulk transmission power line. That power line company is a utility under this code. And so that power line, as it crosses the reservation, is subject to the commission's jurisdiction. If another utility comes to you and says, we want to get a right of way across your land to run a new power line from over here to over there, that transmission company is a utility under your code. So we define it very broadly. It's not just in other words, it's not just your retail utilities. It's not just the gas company. It's not just the water company. It's not just the power company that's providing those services directly to you. It's also the people who have energy infrastructure. We also, of course, the other aspect of this is the telecommunications utilities, phone, broadband. So the telecom utilities are also covered by this code. We do have reserves, so we're not trying to assert any jurisdiction right now because there's no code written for it to assert that jurisdiction, the regulatory code for that yet, but we've reserved it so that eventually, if you decide you want to regulate the telecoms, then it would be added. If you decide you want to regulate water, it would be added.
Pilar, one other clarifying question. Like, so for example, I got like a band member or band members that want to, put solar on their property and they personally own it and all that. Would they be covered under this?
The solar company would.
But them as individuals?
No, but the solar company would.
Okay.
So the solar company would be a utility under this code.
Okay.
And the utility company also could be covered. So, for example, one of the things that we see in utility practice, of course, is this question of net metering. And net metering is when you put solar on your rooftop and you get a credit for the solar power that you produce, and that credit is offset against the power that you use. And there's different forms of net metering. There's different models. In the state of Minnesota, you have two types of net metering models, and the utilities have to follow that. What we've proposed in the code is that the commission could actually create a new net metering program for the reservation that's different from what the state does. So right now, you have to, because you're being serviced by utilities that are regulated only by the state at this point, you can only do what the state lets you do under net metering. So they have a net metering program, that's what you're subject to. This says now that the commission can create a net metering program for the reservation that the utilities would have to follow. So you have your own net metering program. And in that case, your tribal member who wants to put solar panels on their roof, first of all, the solar company would be regulated by the commission, or could be. The commission doesn't have to regulate them if they don't want to, but they could be. The utility certainly is regulated by the commission.
Yeah.
And so if the commission says to the utility, you have to do this kind of net metering program, that's going to inure to the benefit of your tribal member. The way the programs work in Minnesota today, there isn't much economic benefit because of how they've changed the rules.
Yeah.
So you can change the rules back.
Yeah.
So that's where rooftop solar is in effect regulated by the commission. It's through its regulation of the utility and its regulation, potential regulation of the solar company, and its creation of net metering rules for the benefit of your tribal members, the ratepayers.
So we can get better rates then.
Yeah, you can get a better deal.
That's good.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
So a couple of things on this net metering, I appreciate that. So in Minnesota, I think it's 39 kilowatts, and so we could change that to 80 or 100 kilowatts. We could do whatever we wanted if the Tribal Public Utilities Commission decided to up the rate, so you could put on the larger. Okay. And so
California's net metering is 5 megawatts.
Right. But we could do anything like that to set a different scale, so you could do larger community solar or individual houses then, right? Okay. So, thank you. I have another question, which is that if you're trying to put up solar and you're a tribal member, you have to pay, like, I know our experience is that they make you pay this huge insurance for connecting and for the threat that your system might surge or something. And so it's really punitive for putting up renewable energy. It's like $1 million insurance policy to put it up. Now, what jurisdiction would what could we do with the PUC on that?
So if you notice in chapter 6, let's go to chapter 6. So in chapter 6, this is where I've added a bunch of language that actually mirrors federal law called PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. And under federal law, there is a requirement by the federal government that the state utility commissions evaluate certain policies for their utilities that they regulate. So I've taken those federal policies, one of which is net metering, one of which is interconnection.
Right.
Today, the Public Utility Commission of Minnesota regulates interconnection, and they create interconnection standards, interconnection requirements, and the utilities then develop an interconnection process that has to be approved by the PUC in Minnesota. So each utility might have a slightly different process, but they all have to follow the same standards and kind of the state level process. So right now, interconnection is controlled by the state regulatory body. And PURPA says the state needs to look at interconnection. There's another aspect of the federal law that says that every utility, in effect, every utility has to allow for interconnection, but it doesn't say what those rules are. And so that's how a lot of utilities, as you're experiencing now, will say to people who want to interconnect, well, you got to do this study, then you got to do that study, which is not unreasonable. You want to know whether this system is going to have an actual physical impact on their grid. And as long as they own the grid, they're going to be concerned about backfeed, as we call it. Too much power coming off of your rooftop and into their system that they can't regulate, right? Because they got to regulate the frequency of the power. So they have all this technical stuff. And this is one of the big challenges we have, especially in co-op systems like you guys have, or rural systems, which you're also on. And that is, has not been a lot of technological improvement of those systems. I have the fortune of living in Tucson, Arizona, where our utility company is got a bunch of rooftop solar on it. I didn't have to pay $1 million to interconnect. They put me up. Everybody in my neighborhood has got solar. They came out here and put in new transformers to make sure that we weren't blowing out the power lines out here with all the power that we're producing. So that's what utilities are supposed to do. Your utilities, though, especially your co-ops, aren't forced to do that. That's something that your commission can now require them to do. They can require the utility if you develop, and one of the new Chapter 6 authorities is the utility commission. Your utility commission will create policies and programs around the following things, and it's a big list of things, including interconnection. So one's net metering, there's interconnection, there's integrated resource planning. There's a requirement to look at a renewable portfolio requirement, a carbon emissions reduction requirement. So if you wanted the reservation to be 100% renewable, your commission would say 100% renewable. And the utilities would have to go get you 100% renewable power, just like the city of Minneapolis. 100% renewable, and Excel's got to deliver 100% renewable power to the city of Minneapolis. So your commission would have those kinds of authorities. If you wanted to have community solar, I've added a community solar program in there. The commission could develop a community solar requirement. That's different than net metering, and it's different than rooftop solar. It is a little bit bigger. It does require some more stuff. It operates a little bit differently, so it's not exactly the same. So there's a provision in there now that says develop a community solar program. So this is where the RBC gives policy guidance to the commission that we want you to develop policies and programs around these areas. And so the list I've created, one is based out of PURPA, but two is also based out of what I know you guys have been interested in, like doing some rooftop solar. So I wrote some stuff in there to promote that through the commission. So that's how we would see that happen from a regulatory standpoint.
Can I ask? I want another question. Is so one of the there's a lot of work on microgrids. And considering the concerns with energy security for our tribes, microgrids is really kind of a good idea probably for some of our villages. I know that that's increasingly common practice in progressive areas, not necessarily northern Minnesota, but are we able to do that? That's in this new PUC policy too?
Yeah, so microgrids, one of the things we do have in the policy area is distributed energy. So I call it distributed energy because it's more than just solar. The definition of distributed energy is energy that's produced really in the distribution system, which is what you guys are in. You're in the distribution system for the utility. So any energy projects you do in that system that in effect power the buildings and the houses and other activities, other uses EV charging stations, for example, all using electricity. Those are all in distribution systems. So anything you do in there could be solar, could be storage with a bunch of batteries up. It could be diesel engines. You have diesel engines as backup in a lot of your facilities, right? It's critical backup for when you lose power, you fire up the diesel engines. That's a distributed energy resource. It's not clean, but it's a distributed energy resource. So I wrote the language very broadly that says the commission is responsible for, again, a policy or programs that promote distributed energy resource deployment. Microgrids are a distributed energy resource system because it's usually multiple technologies, solar plus storage plus diesel backup, or maybe fuel cell backup, depends on what you got. Might be biomass backup. You guys got a lot of wood, so you could have biomass facilities, biofuels. You could develop those types of different renewable energy and put that into a technology that's distributed in nature. So I wrote the language very broadly to cover all distributed energy resources, and microgrids would be included in that.
Thank you.
The other aspect of kind of chapter 6, which is really your opportunity again to state as a policy, here's where we want the reservation to be around electricity generation, electricity use from a policy standpoint. And the policy statements are important as guideposts for the commission. So while we've proposed and drafted some initial policy goals and statements, again, around net metering, integrated resource planning, interconnection, distributed energy resource deployment, we've also created kind of a generic policy goal around more renewable energy, clean energy, carbon-free energy, and again, this is in keeping with what we've heard and have engaged in conversation with around kind of this overall effort by the part of White Earth. You guys were one of the first tribes, for example, to have, in the lower 48 at least, to have small distributed wind, right? You put a couple of windmills up on some projects. You've done some solar. So, you were kind of leading folks on that. Most tribes don't even use small distributed wind. Some tribes have really big windmills, but they don't have smaller stuff. So you've kind of, this is an opportunity to kind of parlay that approach that you've had, that environmental responsibility approach, and now through the regulatory scheme can use this to enforce those values, force that policy onto the people who are providing power and energy to you. And as you may know, the co-ops get treated very differently under the state regulatory scheme than the IOUs do, than the Otter Tails or the Excels. The co-ops always find a way to kind of carve themselves out of some rules and some requirements. This doesn't treat the co-ops any differently than the IOUs. All the utilities are treated the same. So the co-ops under your scheme don't get to say, well, in Minnesota, we don't have to do X. You get to say, yeah, well, on White Earth, you got to do X. Okay, let me turn to, so chapter 6 and 7 are your policy guidelines. Chapter 7, we have certain purpose standards related to tariffs, net metering, cost of service, the authority to approve community solar programs and other distributed energy programs, and then kind of standard language around how to set rates, how to set tariffs. The idea, of course, that those need to be just and reasonable, that there's a public process for approving rates and tariffs. One of the things that your original draft had was that, and I think partly because the code was modeled after Rosebud, Sioux. And in their code and in your original draft, the utilities would develop a rate or a tariff on their own, how much they're going to charge for the power. And then they would send it to the commission for review. And the commission could either ask for some more information, or if it didn't take any action, the rates and tariffs would automatically go into effect. That's kind of backwards. So the way rate setting works everywhere is, I'm a utility, I want to change the rates, what I charge the customer. So I have to put together an analysis of and substantiate and support why I want to change the rate and why this is the rate, why this should be the rate. So your utility charges you, let's say 9 cents a kilowatt hour out there, probably higher, but let's say 9. And they come in, they go, oh, you know, our costs are increasing, and so we need to increase our rates from 9 to 12 cents. The way your code was originally drafted, they would just do that. They would change the rate from 9 to 12 cents, and they would send you a notice, and you would have 30 days to say, hey, can you give us some more information? But it actually didn't even allow you to say no. All it was kind of a notice requirement on the part of the utility to say to you, we're going to increase the rates from 9 to 12 cents. And all you could say is, okay, give us some more information. You didn't even have power to stop them. Now it's utility, if you want to increase the rate from 9 to 12 cents, you have to come to us and ask us for permission to do that. And you've got to substantiate your rate increase. You've got to give us all the information we need. We're going to have a hearing. We're going to give the public the opportunity to comment on your rate increase. And then we're going to make a decision about what your rate will be. And we will decide what your rate is. And that's how it works everywhere. So we changed your language around to make the commission responsible for setting rates. Why? Because the commission is responsible to you. You're appointing the commissioners, and you're responsible to your tribal members. The other way around, the utility gets to decide for itself, and then the commission has to try and figure out what's going on, and then couldn't even say no. So we want to make sure that, especially around rate setting, the price your tribal members are paying for power, or in the future, water or broadband, whatever the utility might be that you decide to regulate, but those rates are set by the commission and not by the utility. The utility's got to tell you why they want the rate. They've got to substantiate it. They got to support it. It's got to be a public process for rate setting, where the public can comment on the rates that are being proposed, and the commission takes it all in and then makes a decision and says, yeah, you're not going to go from 9 to 12. We'll take you from 9 to 10, but you're not going all the way to 12. And that's the number, 10 cents. That's your number. So we reworked the language to allow, yes.
How does that work with the service, the monthly service fee that the co-ops charge every customer around here?
That's
like
part of the rate
$30
setting. That's part of the rate setting.
So we would have, so are you saying then that would be eliminated? We would have the opportunity to eliminate that?
Yeah, your commission would set the rate. So if the commission says to the co-op, you can't charge that fee anymore, then they can't charge the fee anymore.
Okay, thank you. Awesome.
So chapters 8 through 13 are reserved for water, sewer, broadband, telecom, natural gas. And so we've left those blank for now. And then chapter 14 is really around your hearings and your procedures, the power to hold investigations, inquiries, and hearings. So the rate setting would happen in a hearing process, right? The utility, the way the process would work. And there would be regulations developed to lay this out in more detail. Because the commission should say through regulations, here's the information you need to provide to us, co-op, to substantiate the fees and the rates that you're charging. And so the co-op will have to come into the commission and say, here's our cost. Here's what it costs us to provide power out here. And they're not profit, so they can't ask for a profit on it. They can only just cover their costs. So if they come out to the commission and they say, it costs us, X amount of money to buy power, transmit power, and then distribute the power. We have operations and maintenance, we have overhead. That's the typical rate setting process. The utility comes in and they go, here are all our costs. And so we need this amount of revenue to cover those costs. So here's how we propose to generate the revenue. Now, the co-ops in Minnesota are mostly self-regulated. So they don't actually have to go through a full tariff setting process with the Minnesota PUC. Excel does and Ottertail does, but not the co-ops. They have to file their tariffs and the PUC has to approve them, but the tariffs, the rates are actually set by the co-op's board of directors. And so, but every utility goes through the same basic analysis. How much does it cost me to produce, to generate, transmit, and distribute power? How much does it cost me to operate and maintain my systems? And then how much does it cost me to run my overhead? And so all of that has got to be covered in the price that you pay. The co-ops don't have to make any profit, so your price should be lower, but they still have to cover their costs. So this gives your commission and your tribal members, quite honestly, more insight, more transparency, because the board of directors at the co-op is doing that now. And unless you're participating with the board, they don't have a notice and comment requirement. They don't have a public transparency process requirement. They do it on their own. So your commission at least is creating as well an open public process that your tribal members can participate in and have a more direct influence on the rates that are being set. So that's what your procedures are all about, is creating that process, but again, deferring to the commission for the internal procedures on how to operate and run the process, and then externally the rules and regulations that they would create for hearings, other administrative remedies, and enforcement. And then finally, Chapter 15 is around civil enforcement, so it creates a civil infraction for violating the code, and it creates civil penalties for those infractions. So the Utility Commission not only has the power to enforce its rules and regulations as against the utilities, but we've created a private cause of action that a tribal member can bring a cause of action against the utility for violating certain aspects of the code. And so that Bighorn case, the Bighorn versus Big Man case I just was referencing, was an example of that, where the tribal members sued the utility in tribal court for shutting off his power in the middle of winter in violation of tribal law. So we have a similar enforcement, we call it a private right of action or private cause of action that allows your tribal members to bring action against the utilities for violating this. So as an example, using the rooftop solar. If you have a commission has a rule around interconnecting rooftop solar, and you have a solar company comes out and the utility violates the rule. They either don't interconnect it, or they add other requirements that the commission hasn't approved, like you've got to have $1 million insurance policy. Commission's like, well, we don't have that requirement, so you can't have that requirement. Other utilities will charge you massive interconnection fees. And right now, the PUC lets them do it. The PUC says you have to interconnect everybody, but it's up to you, utility, on your standards for that, how you want to do that, how much to charge people to interconnect. And so in Arizona, for example, smaller projects, not rooftop solar, although those are really backed up because the utility just takes its time to approve rooftop solar installations. But you could, for example, have a rule. You have to interconnect within 180 days. Right now, there's no requirement that they interconnect. People languish for days and years in interconnecting their systems. In Arizona, the public utilities, the utilities here have a APS, for example, charges community solar, smaller solar systems, 5 megawatt systems, for example. They charge them $30 million to interconnect, even though it doesn't cost $30 million to interconnect the system. So those are the places where your commission can really set the rules that will promote more energy projects on tribal lands, whether they're for your tribal members or for the government, rooftop solar, community solar, other distributed energy, or whether it's larger projects. So the commission becomes the front line for not just regulating the utilities, but almost just as importantly, creating rules and programs that support energy deployment, and especially clean energy deployment around the reservation. So with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions on the draft code.
I got a couple more questions. I'm sorry, I'm kind of a bit of an energy geek. So I don't know if there's, on this reservation, Otter Tail Power basically cherry picks the easiest places, and then the rural co-ops, there's about 5 of them that divvy up the rest of them in various rates, whatever they set. So first of all, could you wheel purchase power collectively are there provisions for that in this where tribal government could purchase, like say for the village of White Earth, you wanted to get a certain rate so that people, could all have like some beneficial rate. Is that a part of this? I'm not sure if that is a part of this kind of a regulatory authority, but I know, yeah, so that's my first question.
So one of the things we have in the code is an acknowledgement that the tribe could create its own utility. So if the tribe, let's say, wanted to sponsor the purchase of power from somebody else and bring that power onto the reservation, I would first recommend that you start a utility authority to do that. It doesn't have to be an actual operating utility, but a lot of tribes have done this. They've created virtual utilities through power authority. And they do that. They take the tribal power authority goes out into the market and buys power in the wholesale market or enters into contracts. So a good example, just south of you guys in Oklahoma, 2 of the tribes in Oklahoma joined together. They created a joint power authority, electric power authority, and they went out and they acquired solar power from a local solar project. And so they entered into a contract with that solar project to buy solar power for the tribal communities. And they used a tribal power authority to go do that. So you could do that. You can do that today. You don't need this code to do that. You could do that today. What this code does acknowledge is that the tribe could start up a utility authority, in which case the utility authority would be subject to the code, right? So you want to make sure that your own utility authority is following your own rules and regulations as well. But so the code doesn't prevent that. It doesn't explicitly call for it. But again, it does tell the commission that they have a responsibility to promote clean energy deployment. So if the tribe decided or tribal members decided, tribal members might be a little bit harder, but because you can't, I guess you could start a private utility company. There's nothing that prevents that under the code. So if a bunch of tribal members wanted to get together and start a private utility company, they would be subject to the code. But there's nothing in the code that prevents, the utility company that's regulated, whether it's a tribal utility company or a co-op, nothing that says you can't go buy power from whomever you want to and wheel that power onto the reservation. It's when you start to charge for that power that the code comes into effect. So if the tribe stood up a utility authority and it decided not that it was just going to go buy power, but that it was then going to, sell the power, because there's 2 different transactions there, then the rate they sell it at would be set by the commission. And they would have to justify the rate that they're trying to charge.
So just to clarify, the PUC is one entity, but the second entity would then be a tribal utility that would create these other projects. Is that correct? And then, for instance,
That's one way to do it. Yeah, that's
then-
one way to do it. I mean, you don't have to, but that's one way to do it.
Okay, and then just for one final question, since this tribe is what is it called? Like not a beneficiary, but we're WAPA members, Western,
Okay.
right?
Western
And
Area
so,
Power, yeah.
Yeah, which authority negotiates with WAPA? It's not the PUC, that would be a tribal utility. I mean, I just don't know that we do any negotiations with WAPA for preferential rates or grid
So
access.
typically, tribes usually do two things with their WAPA power. One, they will either take the power directly. So tribes that have their own utilities take their WAPA power. WAPA delivers power to the tribes and the tribal utility. And then they use it on the reservation, right? They sell it as the utility on the reservation. But the other thing that most tribes do, there's only a handful of tribal utilities. So most tribes take their WAPA power and they enter into what's called a bill crediting agreement with their local utility. And so what the tribe says to WAPA is, you'll deliver our power to our local utility, and then our local utility will give us a credit on our bill for that power. So WAPA charges, now it's up to, I think, 4 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour for power. So you have to buy the power. You don't get the power for free. You have to buy the power from WAPA. And so a bill crediting rate, your utility. So let's say Ottertail is your bill crediting partner. So you say to WAPA, send our power to Ottertail. Ottertail will then in turn give us a credit against our bill for that power. And so you don't get paid because you can't really resell the power. Some tribes set up very complicated processes where they will actually get paid for their power. But I haven't seen your agreement, so I don't know if you're getting paid. But sometimes you'll get paid. But sometimes instead of getting paid, it's a bill credit, right? So Ottertail says, okay, we'll buy WAPA power for 4 cents, and then we'll quote unquote resell it to you, tribe. But instead of us writing you a check for 4 cents a kilowatt hour and for however much power we get, we're going to put it as a credit against your bill. So your utility bill gets lowered by the amount of that payment. That's what most tribes do with WAPA. So you can continue to do that in this circumstance. The Utility Commission wouldn't really have a role there. The only real role is if you stood up a utility authority and you said to WAPA, instead of sending our power to Ottertail, send our power to us, because we have a utility authority now, and we're going to go ahead and operate the utility on the reservation. And then WAPA would send you the power instead of sending it to Ottertail.
Thank you.
Laura,
Yes.
this is Douglas Lee.
Hi, Mr. Lee.
Hi. I had a couple questions for you. Wondering, what about railroads?
You could add railroads. You know, utility commissions typically have railroads under their purview. Do you have a train station on the reservation?
Not yet.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the carriage charge, as we call it, right? The rate that railroads charge to haul freight is typically regulated at the state level. So it's much like telephone. It's, you know, the definition of utility under typical state utility law the original term was common carrier. So railroads, stagecoaches, and then it became bus systems, and then sometimes it's taxi cabs, transportation. Public
Airports?
transportation,
Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Airports? Air, what about
That's
the air?
no, airports aren't usually covered under a utility commission. There's usually a separate airport authority that's regulated by FAA. But if you have an airport and you have an airport authority, you know, for any of you flying in and out of Minneapolis, you know, the Minneapolis Airport Authority, when you look at your bill, your ticket charge, you'll see a whole bunch of fees on your ticket, on your airplane ticket. One of those fees is a 9/11 security fee that they continue to collect. That goes to TSA. But the airports themselves will have a fee on there. And so that's how the airports, you know, get revenue for running airport operations. They charge it to, in addition to the, you know, the $5 hot dog that you have to pay when you're in the airport, they charge everybody who flies in and out of that airport on an airport charge. But that's an FAA regulated activity, not a typical utility regulated activity.
Okay. I just had one more. Sorry, everybody. This is a big one. So you had mentioned about like if the lines, so if somebody's lines were coming on to the reservation, we had the Tribal Utility Commission, then we could regulate them because their lines are crossing the res, right? Am I right to hear that?
Yeah, so so we've written into the commission's authority, two types of authority on energy infrastructure that just crosses through the reservation. So it's not serving the reservation, it's just crossing through. Okay. So one authority is siting authority. So if somebody comes to you and says, we want to run a transmission line or a pipeline through your reservation, then they have to come to the commission first to tell the commission where it's going to go. And the commission, under the proposed language, has the responsibility to do the environmental review, to look at the terms and conditions, and then depending on how much you want them to be involved, but they would in effect vet that project for you. Where is it going? You know, how much land is it taking? What are the environmental impacts? Of course, if it's a right-of-way, then it has to be approved by the council. The council has to consent to the right-of-way. So the commission doesn't have that authority to consent. They just cite. They just look at the environmental impacts and citing, et cetera, and gather all that information. And then they would make a recommendation to the council, to the committee, RBC, on whether to approve this right-of-way, this request. The RBC, of course, has the independent responsibility under federal law to consent. So the commission just serves as kind of a vetting process in that circumstance. But part of that negotiation, and you see this, of course, in a lot of right-of-way agreements, is the level of regulatory oversight that a tribe might exercise over that entity for the project on the reservation. And so what I could envision is that the commission, as part of its analysis, says, okay, you know, this transmission line is going to go from here to here. It's, you know, X number of volts, kilovolts. So a lot of issues, a lot of environmental issues. And so we would propose, council, that you negotiate, you know, these kind of taxes, these kinds of fees. And so while they're not providing service to you, the commission could serve an intermediary role that is the one kind of negotiating the terms and conditions of the use of your land for that right of way, for the transmission line or for the pipeline. They don't have the power to tax. So if the RBC wanted to tax, for example, that activity, that's in a separate law, and you would update, if it's not there now, you would certainly want to update your code to allow for you to tax that activity. But the commission would at least kind of gather from a technical standpoint all the issues around putting a new transmission line or putting a new pipeline If there's existing pipelines, of course, and existing transmission lines, so as those right-of-ways come up for renewal, then the commission would be the first line of review for the renewal of those right-of-ways. And now, from a regulatory perspective, you could give the commission, and we haven't gotten to pipelines yet. Natural gas is one of the chapters that's reserved. But in the natural gas chapter pipeline provision chapter, I could see, for example, that the commission has inspection authority over the pipelines. And so, as you know, the pipelines that are existing or that get built, if there's new ones, regardless of what kind of pipeline it is, the tribe should be asserting jurisdiction, and especially public safety jurisdiction, which would include inspection authority to inspect that pipeline whenever you want to. And so that would be left for the pipeline chapter, the natural gas pipeline chapter, or natural gas chapter, which would include distribution and pipelines. So those are some examples of kind of where the commission would, the role the commission would play around regulating transmission lines and pipelines, mostly citing, environmental, could have an inspection role and responsibility. Make sure that, you know, the down power lines, if there's down power lines, or the way the transmission line is being operated, the ability to inspect that. But if you don't have, you can put those in the code. You also, of course, would want them in the easement itself, acknowledging that the pipeline or the transmission line is subject to the tribe's utility code. And so they would have some responsibility to answer to the commission. There was an original provision, which we left in there, that all the utilities have to submit right-of-way information to the commission, so the commission knows where all the right-of-ways are and who they belong to. So the commission is going to be your real estate information keeper as well. So that's contemplated. You had that in your original draft. We left it because that makes sense to have one place where one body, the regulatory body, knows where everything is and who it belongs to.
Any more questions, anyone? Well, thank you, Polaire. I appreciate your time today. I think you really got a lot of good information out there for all of us. You know, I think that, you know, this PUC has been hanging around us for a lot of years now. And I know this is one part that I was working on many years ago too. And it's really good to see that we're gonna get back some of our authority as a nation to regulate power companies. So I know it's something that we're gonna have to, I think, move forward on. So, council, any discussion on this? Glenn?
As legal has submitted to the RBC, we have different options for the RBC to consider if you want to put it back out for public comment for 30 days. If you want to approve it today, it's up to the RBC. If you don't want to take any action today, it's completely up to the RBC on what you want to do. But we have the resolutions prepared and the options for whatever you want to do. Of course, the recommendation from the legal department would be to approve it today.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I think this is something that we've been long waiting for. You know, I know
It's been in the works for a long time.
and I know to put a lot of time in it, and it's like Preller put a lot of time in it, we put a lot of time in it. I know it's been out there for a while, and it just brings back that aspect that we're in charge. We're gonna be in control finally of some of this, instead of us looking on the outside inside.
And it's been, what, now 6, 7, maybe more than that, 9 months since we had our consultation with the Minnesota PUC and said this is the direction we're gonna go, you know? And so I think that acting now would be appropriate, and then going back to the PUC, the Minnesota PUC, and saying, okay, we're doing this.
How do you feel, Al, Ray, Andy?
I should have a comment.
I think it's good. My feeling is that you have a solid document here. That's my opinion, and I support it. I just had one question, which is why would you go back to the Minnesota PUC? You would just inform them that you would have done it, right?
Yeah.
That's
You're-
what I was
that's
saying.
just saying, just
Yeah.
like give them the,
Yeah.
we're done, we're good.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all. Just clarifying.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, the only comment I have is, for the commission, I think can you clarify, are these gonna be like interim, or are they gonna be like the commissioners itself?
So the way that the code is drafted is RBC appoints. And when the RBC appoints the commissioners, they're the commissioners.
So that's like a whole separate meeting then?
Yeah, yeah. Now, as Polaire had mentioned, there's at least one tribe that elects their commissioners. And if that's the process you want to go through, we can make that revision and bring it back.
Yeah, I mean, that'll be the next meeting we have, that's how we're gonna get our commissioners. We can
Yeah.
either interview for them or it'll be interview then appoint, Ellen.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So can we wait until then, Mr. Chair, to vote on that?
No, that's the
I'd
second.
rather get it done because this has been,
This is an accident.
Yeah.
All the other planning stuff is behind it, Ray.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
I like it. I think that we need to do it, like Winona said. A couple of things concern me that Pilar mentioned, when she mentioned broad discretion with investigations. That, along with it being appointed positions, concerns me as a tribal member. I do agree with the idea of it being elected positions. It sounds kind of like a goon squad if it's directed positions, forgive me. If it's directed. If it's elected, there's a lot more third-party integrity.
Well, I think when we enacted today,
Decide who has this broad discretion of investigations upon things.
Well, I think Pilar, can you clarify that? That investigative thing is directly aimed at the utilities itself?
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
not,
that's
it's
to
not like,
investigate utilities.
it's not
Not
like,
to investigate, yeah, it's not to investigate your tribal members as ratepayers. It's to investigate the utility. So if a tribal member comes to the commission and says, my utility is doing X and X is in violation of the rules and regulations, then your utility commission needs the ability to investigate that X, right? What is the utility doing? And so as an example, your net metering, right? Your rooftop solar interconnection. If you have a rule that says you have to interconnect people within 180 days and you can't charge more than X to interconnect them, and so now your tribal members go out and they start trying to do some rooftop solar and the utility starts violating that rule, your tribal members come to the commission. You want the commission to be able to investigate what the utility's doing. They're not going to investigate your tribal members.
yeah.
You're only going to be investigating the utilities. If you have a pipeline company that is doing X and in violation of the tribe's law around pipeline safety, for example, or the regulations around pipeline safety,
So
you want your commission to be able to go investigate that. So that's the broad discretion is obviously they have to have a reason to investigate. But it's the target of the investigation is going to be the utility or the utility provider or the pipeline company. It's not going to be your tribal members.
So that wasn't my concern. Let me clarify, Mr. Secretary Treasurer. That wasn't my concern. But you did mention if a group of tribal members started a utility company themselves, right? So you did clarify the broad discretion, and I thank you for that. I would still like to clarify as a public comment, a tribal member, if being directed positions because of the history that I've experienced here at home, I would just like to recommend it be elected positions. Doug, which?
Well, I don't think it would take long to set that up. I mean, it's just,
Yeah, well,
it's
we-
no different than, kind of like our Elder Affairs Commission, right? So they're gonna be up for election next month. The ballots are gonna be, June. June, yeah, so ballots will be available. I mean, I don't think it's much for us to pull that together.
No, if that's the direction the council wants to go, by all means, we can do it.
That'll be the next meeting, so we'll figure that out.
I would like to,
You know, I don't wanna, I would say it might be worth thinking about appointing some and electing some. Because there might be some people that, are just really knowledgeable. Or do you know what I'm saying? It's like just thinking that through.
Oh, the other piece I had, Pilar, so like for our cannabis commission, we do have provisions in that ordinance or code that says, like if you have like a contract or with the tribe, you can't be a commissioner. Is this the same language in here?
We should have some conflict. I don't have the exact code in front of me right now. We should have some conflict of interest language. If not, we can certainly add it.
Yeah, because I always figured that code's gonna be a living document,
Yeah.
and as the commission
And if-
grows and they get trained, I think that they're gonna be able to change and make those modifications in that code, so. I think it's just gonna be, we're just gonna keep strengthening our sovereignty more and more, so.
Do you have a broad conflict of interest code
Just give them the one we did
or
with
ethics code?
Cannabis Commission has a good one.
Yeah, but does the tribe itself have just a broad code for all tribal government officials, employees?
We have one for all,
Commission, committee
we
members.
have one for all employees.
Yeah.
Whether these commissioners would be employees
I
subject
have
to
one
that
under
code.
contracts too.
Oh, you do have one?
Yeah, I mean, I would
But I mean, these
recommend,
guys
I
aren't
mean, just as a
contract
governance matter.
regulators.
Yeah, as a governance matter, I would just recommend having a broad conflict of interest policy for all of your
For agent.
tribal government officials,
Yeah.
to include your commissioners, your committee members, whomever, so that everybody has the same policy instead of having everybody develop their own policy.
Well, I'd be in favor of passing this today, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that we, in the near future, I would say before the end of the month meeting, maybe have a discussion around what that's gonna look like, if it's gonna be a mixed model, or are we just gonna appoint, or there's gonna be elections or whatever.
Yeah, that's the we can always iron out, and of course, public's always, our membership's always invited to the meetings we have on this, and that's what we want as RBC members, to make sure that we do have the transparency for all members to look at and have input on, so. But I think it's a great thing that we're doing today, so I know something that's gonna be, it's gonna have an impact across the board, so. So motion to approve the PUC, White Earth Public Utility Commission.
So move.
Moved by Alan, second?
second.
Second by Annie, all in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried. Be good. Thank you, everyone. Now we're gonna take a break.
Thank you, it's great to see everybody.
Thank you,
If you don't need
Pilar.
anything further from me, you're
We'll take a
welcome.
break,
I'll
guys.
circle back with Lenny.
We're gonna go into